This is not going to be a particularly technical talk, which is perhaps good for a post-lunch session. So this is going to be a little bit more of storytelling. I'm going to try and introduce you to some of the perhaps less appreciated aspects of the historical development of evolutionary thought, especially from the time of the publication of Darwin and Wallace's papers and Darwin's first book, The Origin of Species, up until the early decades of the 20th century, when the reconciliation of heredity and natural selection finally took place. After that, the story is much better known to pretty much everyone. The so-called neo-Darwinian synthesis, when Mendelian genetics and the principles of natural selection and eventually other aspects of evolutionary ecology, cytogenetics and so on all get welded together into what is often called the modern synthesis or the neo-Darwinian synthesis. The period of about 70 years in between is actually much murkier in terms of how thinking about evolution developed, and it's also a period that is perhaps not that well known even to many people who work in the area of evolutionary biology. So let me start off by asking you guys, it's my understanding that most of you all here are not actually from biology backgrounds. Is that correct? Okay. So have you heard of Darwin? Excellent. Have you heard of August Weismann? No. Have you heard of Ernst Haeckel? Okay. Have you heard of Weldon, Carl Pearson? Okay. Then hopefully there'll be something new in this talk for you. Okay. So if we take as our starting point (1859) in the publication of Darwin's book on the origin of species, and of course this book, some of you might be knowing this, was published in a bit of a hurry because Darwin had been working on this for a very long time. And he was writing this magnum opus on his theory about how evolution happens, and then he receives this letter from a guy called Wallace, who is a naturalist working at that time in Indonesia. And Wallace has independently discovered more or less the same principle of natural selection. And so finally Darwin's one quick paper gets written up, and his and Wallace's papers are presented together to the Linnean Society in 1858. And then Darwin rushes to publish a book which he actually refers to in one place as an abstract of the larger work he was planning to write. And in some seriousness, if one wants to appreciate Darwin's thinking about evolution, one really has to read three books. The first one on the origin of species, 2 volumes of variation in domesticated plants and animals, and finally the third book on sexual selection and the descent of man. These 3 books together actually constitute the totality of Darwin's thought. Now, most of us are probably familiar with the notion that Darwin came up with the principle of natural selection, which is the idea that individuals in populations or species vary, and some variations are going to make the individuals that exhibit them better able to survive and reproduce in a given ecological scenario. And as a result, because heredity ensures that there is some strong resemblance between parents and offspring, those variations will gradually become more common in the population and accumulate over time, and eventually the distribution of that trait in the population can change. So this is in a nutshell the principle of natural selection that Darwin came up with. And at one level, this is very simplistic. It is almost too simple, and I'm sure many people like Huxley would say, well, why didn't somebody else think of this before? But more than that, what I would like to focus on in this talk, for the beginning part at least, are a few aspects of Darwin's work that are sometimes not appreciated that much, which is that Darwin didn't just provide a mechanism for natural selection. Wallace also did that, and there are some interesting differences between Wallace's and Darwin's conception of natural selection. I'll briefly talk about those as well. What Darwin did more than anything else is he accomplished two conceptual things. One was Darwin reconceptualized heredity completely compared to how heredity was viewed at that time. That's one thing we'll talk about, the reconceptualization of heredity in a novel way, and that conceptualization in many ways is still with us today and is still causing heartburn in certain communities. And he achieved what Richard Lewontin much later referred to as the atomization of the individual. And to come to these in sequence, both of these are tied up with Darwin's particular notion of natural selection. And so I'll start with that. So Darwin, when he talked about selection, was very heavily influenced by the analogy to plant and animal breeding. Darwin was familiar with breeding, as many Englishmen of his time were, and he was also in touch with a lot of breeders. And breeders essentially dealt with variable populations. They typically dealt with complex, often quantitative traits, and they basically selected individuals that had extreme version of the trait that the breeder fancied and used them to specifically breed from. And over a period of time, the mean value of that trait in the population shifted in the direction the breeder wanted. And breeders were aware of several things. They were aware that you could shift trait distributions quite a bit, fairly rapidly. They were also aware that very often if you selected for a while and obtained a shift in the trait distribution and then stopped selecting, the trait would fairly rapidly revert back to ancestral values from which you started. That was also familiar. It was also noticed by the breeders that if you selected for a very long time, many generations, very often if you then stopped selecting, the trait would not actually revert back too much. So all these observations were around at the time of Darwin, and Darwin built up the whole argument of natural selection by analogy to breeding. Wallace, on the other hand, built up his notion of natural selection by analogy to competition. And so Wallace's vision of natural selection is actually selection acting through the differential extinction of varieties within species. It's a sort of a within species, among group competition that causes the characteristics of the species to change because some varieties get wiped out, other varieties predominate. It's not really selection among individuals within a variety or within a population. That was Darwin's view, and this is a very big difference in the way Darwin conceptualized natural selection, Wallace conceptualized natural selection. Darwin was focused on the individuals because of the analogy with breeding again, and essentially he said that the ecological scenario, the environment, biotic and abiotic, that is faced by a population of a species is what takes the role of the breeder in terms of determining which variants are going to be better able to survive and produce offspring. Now, the minute you focus on individuals, you run into a problem. An individual consists of many traits or expresses many traits. And it is the totality of these traits. It's not just the size of the individual that will determine its ecological success at survival and reproduction. It might also be determined by other things, including the individual's endurance, the individual's ability to run fast, the individual's ability to hunt actively. So an individual is comprised of so many different traits, and it is the sum total of all these traits, all these characteristics that will determine and individual success. Now, if you were to take individual by individual in a population and characterize them at all the traits that are relevant to performing in their ecological context, you will have hundreds, if not thousands of traits per individual. You will have multiple variants of those traits across individuals. So effectively, each individual will be unique. If any of you happen to be familiar with something called the infinite alleles model in population genetics, you will end up with an infinite individuals model. Every individual will be unique and different, therefore, from its offspring. And so, while one realizes that selection is operating via the reproductive and survival success of these unique individuals, if one focuses at the level of the holistic individual, one will be left with an explanation of how one collection of unique individuals was in the next generation replaced by another collection of equally unique but different individuals. And that will not be too much of an explanation in terms of being able to make predictions that could be meaningful. And here again the analogy with breeding comes in. So when a breeder breeds, of course there are other traits of the animal or plant that are relevant to its survival. The breeder says, I'm going to focus on one trait. I'm selecting for increased body size. I'm just going to measure body size and choose the largest guys to breed from. You're basically choosing extreme variants of one trait averaged over all the other traits in the background of that individual. And this is what actually Darwin occasionally explicitly but mostly implicitly suggested, that you actually focus instead of individuals on trait variants. In other words, you take one or a few traits at a time, average over everything else, don't bother about the other traits, and then ask, on an average, are taller individuals surviving better than shorter individuals, regardless of what other traits each individual tall or short guy happens to have? This is what Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould later on referred to as the atomization of the individual, and severely criticized, in my opinion, for largely misplaced reasons. If you do not do this atomization of the individual, there is no hope of an evolutionary theory. And while criticizing this focus on variants of particular traits rather than the holistic phenotype of the individual, Gould and Lewontin actually never came up with any alternative to this. They just criticized it by saying that, well, it's the individual that reproduces, it's the individual that survives, so how can you just focus on one trait in a vacuum? And the point is, you're not focusing on one trait in a vacuum, you're focusing on one trait averaged across all other trait variants at different traits. If you can do this, then for one trait at a time or a few traits at a time, you can actually say, okay, how does the distribution of body size change in the population while we look at body size sort of averaging over everything else? How does the distribution of beak length change in a population? How does the distribution of any trait you like change in the population? And then the tracking of that change, how the composition of the population over generations changes with regard to variants of that trait, that became the focus of building up an evolutionary theory. And this focus is largely due to Darwin's conceptualization of evolution really being looked at trait by trait rather than whole individual by whole individual. And of course, the point is that in some sense, individuals also do not have continuity over generations. Individuals just reproduce and die. It's really the trait distributions that have the continuity and that change. And in a few places in The Origin of Species, Darwin actually specifically talks about this. And much of it is not very specific. The reason I stress this point is that the confusion between individuals and trait variants has dogged evolutionary biology ever since. It has led to a lot of confusion because perhaps being individuals ourselves, we like to cast our evolutionary writing in terms of individuals. if you read evolutionary biology books, a lot of them will say things like, well, you can think of an individual as though the individual was trying to maximize its Darwinian fitness, or you go into the realm of social evolution, you'll say, well, you can think of individuals as though they were trying to maximize their inclusive fitness. And the point is that if you need to put a caveat that this is not actually what's happening, but you can think about it this way at the individual level, why is it so important for us to think about the individual? Actually, the individual is the biggest red herring in evolutionary biology. It's really the trait variants. But the problem is that, and here Darwin himself is guilty of this. Darwin a lot of the time writes about individuals as being the centerpiece of the action. And of course, the individuals are the centerpiece of the action in terms of the ecological struggle for existence that's happening. But if you look at the consequences of that struggle that happens between individuals for the change in the population, it is better viewed in terms of the trait variants, not the individuals. But Darwin writes about individuals all the time. And this situation, in some sense, I think, this is my speculation, I think it's because we like agency, and writing and thinking about individuals somehow gives us an illusion of agency. And I think that is why this is so common. This is particularly notable in the works of William Hamilton. If you read Hamilton's original papers on kin selection, which was the idea that an individual can improve or enhance its Darwinian fitness not through just its own reproduction because its own genes are getting passed on to the next generation, but through the reproduction of its close relatives, in which case the relatives share many copies of the same genes as this individual, so those genes are still passing on. If the individual perhaps does not reproduce that much but helps its relatives to reproduce more. And if you read Hamilton's original paper on this, at least if you are me, you'll tear your hair out because it is very confusing. He keeps first talking about individuals and the inclusive fitness of individuals. Then he starts doing the math and the individuals vanish from the math. The math is all done at the level of allele frequencies in population genetics language. And then the discussion comes back and starts again talking about individuals as holistic entities. And much later, I came to know by talking to a few people who were in this and reading a most interesting paper by Stephen Frank, who was one of the last students of Hamilton. And Stephen Frank actually writes that Hamilton deliberately wrote up all this stuff in terms of individuals and inclusive fitnesses, even though the entire theory was built without reference to individuals, because he was trying to reach the behavioral ecology community who were very comfortable thinking about individuals. So he wanted to write it up in language that they felt comfortable with, and in the result, created confusion that is still going on. I don't know how many of you happen to be aware of this, but there's still some debates over kin selection raging in the literature back and forth about whether it makes sense or not, and in some sense the debate is completely meaningless. It's entirely because of the confusion between individuals and trait variants. Yeah. No, I just mean a distinct individual member of that species. So I'm thinking in terms of say mammals or insects, not in terms of colonial aggregate animals or plants. So I'm not thinking of grasses, I'm not thinking of corals. I'm thinking of like a individual fly, a individual butterfly in that sense. Because every individual, if you consider it holistically and consider all the traits of that individual, each individual is going to be effectively unique. So then what are you going to track? Change in what? If you have a population of n unique individuals, each unique type occurs with a frequency of 1 by n. In the next generation, there will be n different individuals and each different unique type will occur with a frequency of 1 by n. It doesn't help in terms of explanation, in terms of making predictions. Whereas if you can focus on traits rather than the holistic individuals, that is what becomes the basis for a reasonably meaningful evolutionary theory to develop. Well, that would depend on what it is about the community that you are trying to study. Many things in communities are studied at the level of the community, at the level of the species that make them up, the kind of trophic composition of species that you have. I don't think evolutionary theory has particularly reached the phase where we have a detailed evolutionary theory of interacting species in a community. We have at best evolutionary theories of 2 or 3 interacting and co-evolving species. Any other questions? Yeah?
Is there example where we can see this the evolutionary theories are treated as individuals, like they're explained in terms of individuals as opposed to the trait variants?
No, there is no serious theory per se. There are some sort of verbal arguments that it would be much better to do this, most notably by Gould and Lewontin and many others, but there's no theory. There's no formal theory about that at all.
So like if people follow the trait variants more than the individuals, like
yes,
why we have the argument at all that like we should go to the individuals, or like?
See, personally that beats me too. I would like to, as I said, I mean, I think individuals are just a big red herring, but people still seem to prefer to write about their work in terms of individuals and conceptualize it to some extent in terms of individuals, and that is what causes the confusion. It's confusing. It would be much better if people just focused clearly on trait variants and stuck to that instead of getting lost in trying to frame things in terms of individuals. It would be very helpful. Yes, yes. So if it's a quantitative trait, of course, the variations will be on a quantitative scale or a continuous scale. Okay, so the reason for stressing this was that this confusion between individuals and trait variants is at the heart of many ongoing debates in evolution that do not get resolved, partly because in some sense they are not a real debate. See, if it's a clear debate with 2 sides and one side is right and the other side is wrong, those debates get resolved sooner or later, and usually sooner. Some of these debates, for example, this confusion is also at the heart of the units of selection debate, which has occupied biologists and philosophers of biology for decades. And once again, it's a slightly meaningless debate, although it does generate a lot of literature. But more importantly, I wanted to highlight the fact that it was actually Darwin who made this distinction right in the first book. And this was one of the big conceptual changes that Darwin brought about in the way people were thinking about evolution, because people were thinking about evolution before Darwin also. Evolution was already very much a part of at least academic biology by the time Darwin's book comes about. So what is novel there is the mechanism of natural selection and this conceptualization of focusing on trait variants rather than whole individuals. And the other one is the concept of heredity. And in order to appreciate how Darwin reconceptualized heredity, we need to go back a little bit and look about what the state of heredity was at that time. Today, most of us have grown up in an era where genetics has been quite dominant within biology and has, in fact, overshadowed many areas of biology. And it's hard for us perhaps to imagine that there were eras in biology when heredity was not center stage and was not the most important thing going on. And prior to Darwin, if you look at the early part of the 19th century, heredity really wasn't center stage at all. what was center stage in a very big way was embryology, or what we would today call developmental biology, the science of trying to understand how a single fertilized egg eventually gives rise to a complex organism which has multiple cell types in different tissues and so on. So this whole process by which a fertilized egg goes through various embryonic stages and eventually becomes an organism with complex and different cell types in it that work in a coordinated way. This was at that time referred to as the queen of the biological sciences, and embryology was the happening thing in the early 19th century. In fact, in the early 19th century, when people used the phrase experimental biology, they meant embryology. Just as today, sometimes when people use the phrase modern biology, at least in India, they mean molecular genetics. And heredity was a small part of embryology. So heredity was considered as within the domain of embryology, within the domain of trying to explain how a fertilized egg gives rise to the adult. And the idea was, by that time, the notion that some differentiation of cells and tissues takes place during development had gotten more widely accepted, as opposed to the notion that the organism is already there in miniature and simply grows, which was the so-called pre-formationist view of embryonic development, that every fertilized egg is a miniature organism and it just expands in size. That was discredited. The idea that from a single cell, multiple cell types must differentiate had become entrenched. So the role of how people thought about heredity was in terms of what is the mechanism by which the instructions for this differentiation process within embryology are transmitted from the sperm and the egg, or the pollen and the egg, to the next generation's fertilized egg, the starting point of the next generation's individual. And in this sense, if you think about it, see, heredity has two aspects to it. Heredity is about explaining both similarities and differences. Offspring, by and large, are similar to their parents, but offspring are also not identical to their parents. And any science of heredity must address itself to both of these aspects of parent-offspring similarity and difference. The earlier conceptualization of heredity in terms of embryological instructions was focused very much on maintaining the type or maintaining similarity across generations. In other words, it was focused on, let's say, trying to say why the offspring of a crow will always be a crow and not become a frog or a starling instead. It was a focus on the transmission of information leading to similarities between parents and offspring at a gross scale. And it was very much playing second fiddle to the central question of embryology, which was to try to unravel the mechanisms of cell differentiation. Darwin sort of turned this notion around on its head and focused on the inheritance not of similarities. He took that as the background by saying that, oh, well, yes, a crow's offspring will be a crow. That we can take for granted for reasons that we may not exactly know, but let's take that as an empirical fact. And then let's focus on the question, why does the offspring of a crow that has a beak length of 3 centimeters, why are some of its offspring having beaks that are 4 centimeters long and some that are only 2 centimeters long? And what is the distribution of beak lengths like in the offspring of that crow? So the focus for Darwin shifted to understanding the inheritance or the transmission of variation of traits rather than the inheritance of the trait itself, which he took for granted that if you are going to have an offspring of a crow, it will have the beak of a crow. So let's take that as background and let's focus on variations of beak size, variations of beak shape, and so on. Okay, Darwin didn't use this particular example. I'm just using a crow as an example. But the point that, and at Darwin's time, if you recollect, nobody really knew anything about the mechanisms of heredity. Interestingly, just like Mendel, Darwin also did crossing experiments. This is another facet of Darwin's activities that is not very well known. Darwin actually did crossing experiments very similar to the kinds of experiments that Mendel used to do with peas. Darwin also did them with peas. And Darwin actually did obtain 3:1 ratios of certain trait pairs, just like Mendel did. And Darwin could not make sense of it beyond that, and he left it there. Mendel went on and made a model based on alternative forms of the same gene and so on, which we are all familiar with in basic genetics now. So Darwin was interested in heredity because he realized that heredity was central to how selection worked. Because if certain individuals, by virtue of the traits that they carry, are better able to survive and reproduce, selection will not change anything unless their offspring are also likely or more likely than an average person to carry those traits. So Darwin, in his book, invokes what he variously calls the strong force of heredity, the force of heredity. Basically, all that Darwin said was, look, we don't know the mechanisms of heredity, but what we do know is that offspring do tend to resemble parents more than a randomly drawn individual from the population would. And again, Darwin did not express it explicitly in probabilistic terms, but that's what it amounts to. And so he focused on heredity not in terms of the mechanism, but in terms of the outcome. The outcome being what is the correlation between the trait value of the parent and the trait value of its offspring on average. That's the outcome of some unknown mechanism by which this information is transmitted to the next generation. And what Darwin realized very clearly was that the mechanism is not all that important. The outcome of the mechanism in terms of the degree of similarity is actually important to how the struggle for existence will accumulate these changes over generations. So he switched focus in heredity from mechanisms to the outcomes, and switched focus in terms of explaining similarities to explaining the inheritance of variations, of differences. And in that sense, he actually altered the course of heredity in many ways, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. And more than that, Darwin, by casting heredity along with natural selection as the two sort of pillars on which the theory of evolutionary change was built, he moved heredity to a very important central focus in biology from being an obscure part of embryology. And in some sense, what happened afterwards with Mendel and in the 20th century is a continuation of that. Genetics, as we now call heredity, continues to be center stage in biology in a very major way. The whole thing is looking over large populations. In fact, one of the things that Darwin is credited with, although in a slightly misplaced way by Ernst Mayr, is that he introduced so-called populational level thinking into biology. He introduced populational level thinking in a very specific sense of these distributions of trait variance, or in this context, actually. What's more important is not that he introduced populational thinking, but that he introduced thinking about individual traits and their variations rather than trying to account for the holistic organism or holistic individual. Yes.
The trait variants, so that's the phenotypes. So if I take individual from a particular phenotype, can I safely say that all the individuals of a particular phenotype is similar in terms of that particular trait?
Yes, so supposing you have a trait which is, let's say, eye color, and there are blue-eyed and brown-eyed individuals. If you collect all the brown-eyed individuals, that is one trait variant for the trait eye color. The blue-eyed individuals together constitute individuals exhibiting the other trait variant. So now, in the Darwinian view, what we are saying is that we can take all the brown-eyed guys, ask on average how many offspring do they produce, take all the blue-eyed guys, ask on the average how many offspring do they produce. Now, some blue-eyed guy will be tall, some will be short, some will have big teeth, some will have small teeth. We are averaging over all that variation. And if we find that on an average, just distinguishing between blue and brown eyes and no other trait, if you find that the brown-eyed guys on average leave more offspring than the blue-eyed guys, then you can say that the brown-eyed trait variant has higher Darwinian fitness than the blue-eyed trait variant.
And also to connect with the example of crow that you gave, that Darwin did not explain why the crow will not have beak. I'm just telling that suppose 3 centimeter beak, 4 centimeter beak, and 5 centimeter beak are 3 different type of traits. And also Darwin told of the heredity of the traits. So according to Darwin, one of the traits are to be inherited. So the offspring should have at least one of these 3 traits. That's I want to just clarify.
Well, if there were only 3 variants, but if we're talking about beak length, it's a quantitative trait, it's continuously distributed, so in some sense, offspring will show some distribution of beak lengths. If you look at the collection of all the offspring of a certain individual, there will be some distribution of beak lengths. And maybe some of this might become a little clearer as we go along. So, if we look at after Darwin what happened, it's actually quite interesting. The notion of evolution, that it happens, gained a lot of traction with Darwin's book, especially the first book, because the first book was a huge argument and collection of facts that were all consistent with this certain notion of evolution. And it helped convince many people. And Darwin's book was translated very early into other languages. The book came out in English in the first edition in 1859. In the early 1860s, a young Ernst Haeckel in Germany, who was then doing field work collecting marine invertebrates in Naples, was already reading the German translation of Darwin's book and becoming a committed Darwinist himself. And Haeckel went on to write in German about the Darwinian theory of evolution. And at least till about 1930, Haeckel's book in German and its various translations had outsold Darwin's original. In the Indian context, it's interesting to note that in the late 1880s, probably 1880s or 1890s, Mahatma Gandhi wrote a letter to Ernst Haeckel requesting for permission to translate his German book about Darwinian evolution into Gujarati, because he felt that it would be of great benefit to educate people in India about this theory of evolution. Interestingly though, instead of a sort of a straight progression of acceptance of evolution by natural selection and a gradual elaboration of the theories over the next 70 years, what actually happened was evolution was even more better accepted than it was prior to Darwin's book. By the 1880s, naturalists were interpreting their field expedition observations in terms of Darwinian evolution. The studies of mimicry, for example, in the 1880s, mimicry in butterflies, was now being interpreted in terms of adaptive benefits, Darwinian fitnesses, and so on, although the term fitness was not in vogue at that point. So what was already achieved was a shift in which the people who worked earlier on just describing variation in species and species interactions in nature now were trying to use those observations as at least supportive evidence for Darwin's theory of evolution. So evolution was very well accepted. The principle of natural selection was not. The principle of natural selection was actually not accepted by very large numbers of very influential biologists, including a most interesting character who happened to be Darwin's cousin called Francis Galton. And so in the decades after Darwin, there are two almost interestingly opposite trends. And again, just like we like talking about individuals, we like talking about dichotomies. So I'm going to talk about two and sort of brush aside a lot of the background. There are many more voices than just these two, but just to make a contrast, I'm going to focus a little bit on the approach taken by Francis Galton and the approach taken in Germany by August Weismann. So I said that Darwin posited that the two major phenomena that come together to explain evolutionary change in the composition of populations are heredity and natural selection. What these two very strangely did was focused on one to the almost exclusion of the other. Galton pretty much focused almost exclusively on heredity and denied a major role in evolution to natural selection. August Weismann focused almost exclusively on natural selection and almost denied a role to heredity in evolution. And these approaches set the stage for a lot of developments that eventually happened. So let me just talk about Weismann first, briefly what his idea was, and then I'll talk about Galton, because Galton's ideas eventually give rise to a lot of things, even though the basic insights were in some sense not entirely correct. So Weismann believed that natural selection was a very important force, and he actually almost deified natural selection in a way that some writers in the 20th century also did and were soundly criticized for doing. But if you ever read the evolutionary literature and you get slightly put off by phrases like selection is doing this, selection is doing that, as though selection was some kind of God sitting up there and actively selecting things, that all really started with people like August Weismann, that kind of omnipotent selection. And the point was that Weismann almost denied that heredity together with selection would be required for evolutionary change. For him, selection alone would dictate evolutionary change, and selection for him almost included heredity in it, at least in terms of managing the transmission of similarities. So Weismann's view was, if there is no selection, there will be chaos. Organisms will cease to be proper holistic organisms. They will become sort of chaotic combinations of parts which are not even viable, which will not survive. It's a very strange view, and one is not entirely sure what the antecedents of this view were and why he took such an extreme view of natural selection. But in some ways that didn't lead to a great deal. And so we shift our focus to Francis Galton. Galton was interested in heredity. He realized that heredity was the central issue in evolution other than natural selection. And he started off his studies on heredity initially by doing experiments to disprove Darwin's theory of heredity called pangenesis. So Darwin had actually come up with a speculation that there are particles that are created from each organ in the body that circulate in the bloodstream and carry hereditary information, and then they are distilled into the sperm and the eggs. And these particles, which he called gemmules, are therefore sort of the units of heredity and so on. And Galton set out to test this by saying that, well, if all this hereditary material is floating around in the bloodstream, then if you do a complete blood transfusion from an animal with one phenotype to an animal with another, you should be able to change the phenotype. So he transfused blood from black-colored rabbits to white-colored rabbits and looked as to whether they became black or not, and realized that they don't. and then wrote a paper in Nature, which is actually a masterpiece of diplomatically saying, I killed your theory without ever really saying that. It's a very interesting paper. So he's basically killed the theory of pangenesis, but he avoids saying that because he did like Darwin, he idolized Darwin. Darwin was sort of an elder cousin whom he hero worshipped, but he completely wiped out that theory, and instead he began to focus on a very statistical approach to heredity based on, again, interestingly, Darwin's original insight that it's the degree of similarity that matters, not the mechanism by which it comes about that matters evolutionarily. And Galton came up with this notion that if you were to make a plot of this kind, if you take some trait, for example, height, and on the x-axis, let's say you plot the mean parental height for each pair of parents, so mother and father, what their mean height was, that's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you plot the mean offspring height. Then whatever traits you do this for, you typically find a linear relationship, of course with scatter around it, and the slope of this relationship is always less than 1. This incidentally is the beginning of the statistical technique of linear regression. And in case any of you ever wondered why a technique for finding the best fitting straight line is called regression or going backwards, the answer is in Galton's work. So Galton interpreted the fact that the slope was always less than 1 as saying that if you are looking at parents of very extreme phenotype, high or low compared to the population mean, their offspring are also extreme, but not as extreme as their parents were. They return back towards the population mean by some distance. And that was the regression to the mean that he was talking about, and that is why this technique of line fitting is actually called going backwards. It's the offspring going back towards the population mean. And based upon this, Galton created an elaborate theory of what he called the principle or law of ancestral heredity, because he also noticed that if you were to replace this and look at the regression of grand offspring trait on grandparents' traits, you will still get a linear regression. It will be weaker. It will have more noise, it will have an even smaller slope, but it's still a non-zero slope. And so Galton built up this theory of ancestral heredity, which said that heredity is a accumulating influence of all past generations, but the weightage of the immediate parental generation is the maximum. So if they contribute half of your hereditary endowment, grandparents contribute 1/4, great-grandparents contribute 1/8, great-great-grandparents contribute 1/16, and so on. And he built up what he believed was a very quantitative law of heredity, and he interpreted this slope as determining or reflecting the degree to which the trait was determined by nature versus nurture. So he interpreted this slope as being the degree to which this trait was determined by hereditary factors. And as we today understand it, that interpretation is actually wrong, but this slope, which he termed the heritability of the trait, is still called the heritability of the trait, and we still use it, but we interpret it very differently from how Galton did, and we'll talk about that in the second talk after coffee. Now, once Galton built up this theory of ancestral heredity, he conceptualized heredity in a slight departure from Darwin, as an inherently conservative force. So heredity, to his mind, because it involved the accumulated weightage of hereditary endowments from all previous generations, it was a force that would tend to bring individuals back towards the population mean. And he believed that is why you see this slope always being less than 1. So you see a regression to the mean. And because he believed that heredity would tend to bring you back to the population mean. So if there is an extreme parent, a parent with extreme phenotype, the offspring will be more towards the average, or in Galton's terms, more mediocre in the original sense of the term, not the way we use it today. Therefore, what Galton believed was that natural selection acting among individual variations in a population would not be very effective because it would be counteracted by the force of heredity. So he sort of saw this as a tug of war. Natural selection is trying to make you bigger, heredity is pulling you back towards the population mean. And at some point, they're going to balance out, and you're really not going to be able to get long-term evolutionary change in any direction as a result of natural selection. And so Galton actually downplayed the role of selection acting on individual variations and instead developed a fairly interesting idea, which in some ways echoes Wallace's views more than Darwin's, that ultimately selection would be among varieties of a population, not among individuals, because among individuals, heredity would just counteract selection and not allow it to work. And this remained the dominant view for quite some time after this work. So this work was done around the very, very late 19th century. And more to the point, Galton's work brought two people into the picture who left a remarkable stamp on evolutionary thought. One was a zoologist called Raphael Weldon, the other mathematician and statistician called Carl Pearson, he of the Pearson's correlation coefficient fame. Weldon was greatly inspired by reading some of Galton's papers and immediately sort of realized, in line with what Galton was by that time preaching, that the way to analyze both heredity and selection was statistical. This was again a very big conceptual shift in how people perceived we should be studying evolution. So by the time you come to Weldon and the later writings of Galton, there is this very strong emphasis that the proper tools or the appropriate tools to analyze evolution and heredity and selection is to use statistical techniques to either look at parent-offspring correlations, grandparent-grand-offspring correlations, or to look at how the statistical distributions of traits change over time and over space. And it was largely in order to deal with these empirical problems of very interesting data that Weldon started collecting that Pearson and Weldon collaborated, and Pearson actually developed many of his statistical techniques in this context. So in fact, even before Fisher, the development of statistics is very heavily dominated by evolutionary questions that people were trying to address. Much of Pearson's work on decomposing distributions into a multitude of normal distributions, sort of the way you do Fourier transforms, that is all inspired by trying to deal with Weldon's data. So a lot of statistical theory was developed to deal with these data. And what Weldon was trying to do was A, confirm Galton's prediction that quantitative traits or continuous traits would follow approximately normal distributions in nature, which fitted in with a certain view of how traits were constructed that Galton had, and Weldon first provided data to support that from studies on marine invertebrates. He then began to look at trying to find evidence for natural selection in action on populations. And first he did this indirectly by looking at the distributions of the same trait in different populations of the same species and finding that they are indeed normally distributed in both species, but with very different means and variances. And they somewhat speculatively interpreted this as suggesting that natural selection is shaping the trait differently in these two different geographical locations. Next, they found populations of the same species, looked at the sum of the same traits, and for a couple of the traits, they found distributions that were not normal, that were skewed for the trait values. And that was when this collaboration really began bearing fruit, and Pearson developed first the statistical techniques for partitioning a distribution into component normal distributions, and then finally sort of said something like, well, if this is the distribution, you can think of this as being made up of these two normal distributions. And they tentatively interpreted this as suggesting that this was a population that was in the process of splitting into two types under the influence of selection. This is a very tentative speculation, but historically, these are some of the first studies, and these studies are done in the first few years of the 20th century. These are some of the first studies in which people are trying to empirically capture the activity of natural selection in a wild population. Do you have a question? Yeah. After that, yes. They tentatively interpreted as switching. You're absolutely right. They could be merging. They could be merging. But I think they were thinking in terms of splitting, and it's a tentative speculation, but it's a very novel kind of result in the history of natural selection, where you're trying to say that you can actually catch evolution in action. And in principle, you could come back after 10 years to the same population and see whether they had grown further apart, those two distributions, or merged better, and so on. Weldon also wrote in one of these papers what perhaps cannot be bettered in terms of a prescription for what you would have to show to demonstrate selection in action. And he said, if you want to really demonstrate selection, what you need to do is go through the different life stages of the organism, follow the same trait through different life stages, account for any developmental correlations between traits at different life stages, and then ask whether the mean of that trait or the variance of that trait is changing across life stage or age. Because if selection is acting on that trait at some point, then the adult distribution might become very skewed compared to the juvenile distribution, and so on. This is, again, conceptually a very important statement. I mean, in some sense, if we look at how we go about measuring selection in the wild today, we are doing what Weldon said needed to be done, essentially. It's a remarkable series of statements on what you need to do. And he proceeded to then do exactly that. So they next found in the same location in Plymouth Bay, they were looking at a species of crab over years, and they were collecting specimens over the years, and he noticed that the frontal width of the crab's head is reducing, the mean width is reducing over the years. And he then speculated that this is an evolutionary change that is happening under some form of natural selection for smaller head width. And then he further speculated that this might be because of the increasing pollution levels and increasing sediment levels in this bay over the last decade or so, because there had been some constructions and some industries added, as a result of which there was a lot more fine particulate matter going into the bay. The bay was becoming more muddy, more silty. So he speculated that the environmental change that is driving this selection force is this increased sediment. Then he did a very early experimental evolution study, if you like, although this is not the first experimental evolution study. The first experimental evolution study is actually done in the 1860s to 1870s on single-celled organisms in a chemostat, where people reared these guys starting at 25 degrees centigrade, gradually kept increasing the temperature, and eventually evolved that strain into a heat-loving strain that could no longer survive at the lower temperature, but was very well adapted to a higher temperature. And this was actually never published as a paper. This result is published as the presidential address by the author to the British Biochemical Society or something like that. And it's actually amazing that the first experimental evolution study happens within 5 years after Darwin's book. I mean, to me, as an experimental evolutionist, that's amazing. But then what Weldon does is he takes populations of these crabs, keeps them in aquaria with and without additionally added silt, and looks at the mortality rates of crabs with different head sizes, and actually sees that when you add silt into the water in the aquarium, the larger crabs are the ones that preferentially die off. And then he actually goes back to being a real zoologist and does dissections and realizes that with the larger guys, the larger head width crabs have a certain kind of gill structure. They ingest more silt, it jams up their gills, and that's why they die. And in this set of studies, he essentially provides reasonably convincing evidence for natural selection following a change in the environment, actually resulting over a few years in a change in the mean head width of the crab population of that bay. And this is a truly amazing study. And again, it's a bit of a tragedy, in my opinion, that Weldon is not better known, even among evolutionary biologists, than he is. Interestingly, around this time, so Weldon and Pearson, yes?
If heredity is the story of some signal transferred from one generation to another, and you have said that each individual is unique, then does it mean that during the process of transfer, there is some loss of information or something, or if the signal transfer is biased by some internal process?
Yes, it is affected by internal processes like recombination and which copy of which gene actually ends up in the successful sperm or egg, because we have 2 copies of each gene, but each sperm or each egg will carry only one of the copies at random. So there is some loss of information due to the sampling from 2 copies of each gene to 1 copy of each gene stage. There is loss of information in terms of combinations of which allele you have at different genetic loci because of recombination. And then the signal is recombined from another such signal coming from the other parent to produce the new piece of information, which is the offspring.
Thank you.
Yeah.
As you told, the experiment on the crabs, yeah, in the first class, it was shown that apart from the natural selection, environment itself can bring the change in the phenotype. And the example that you told about the crabs, so how the effect of environment should be seen? Is it introducing change through natural selection or directly introducing change?
It is through natural selection. That is not to say that the environment cannot induce phenotypic change. It can. And that's a very well-known phenomenon, very widespread phenomenon called phenotypic plasticity. But this is a case where if you look at experimentally, when you add the silt, it doesn't cause the crabs to grow smaller. It causes the larger crabs to die at a higher rate. The data is very clear that this is a case of selection. But phenotypic plasticity is a very real phenomenon and very widespread, certainly. So, around this time, which is the turn of the 19th to 20th century, of course, the other big thing that happens is the rediscovery of Mendel's laws. And suddenly there are principles of the mechanism of heredity, although the mechanics are not quite worked out, but we know the laws followed. And this happens alongside the backdrop of all this work by people like Weldon and Pearson, which was developing statistical concept of heredity and statistical methodologies to deal with analyzing heredity. And now comes along this somewhat more direct method of looking at heredity by comparing contrasting discrete trait variants. So Mendelian genetics works on discrete trait variants. Those are the classic examples, red versus white flowers, or round versus wrinkled seeds, etc., blue or brown eyes in humans. Whereas Weldon and Pearson were focusing on continuously varying traits, typically normally distributed, and looking at how those distributions were affected by heredity and by natural selection. So around this time, another view comes about, and the people really associated with this view are Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, and particularly William Bateson in the UK. And there's a sort of a side and very tragic angle to this. Bateson was 1 year younger than Weldon, and they went to the same college, and indeed Weldon sort of mentored Bateson during college and was responsible for Bateson getting interested in evolutionary questions. Later on, they ended up on two sides of what increasingly became a bitter debate, and it sort of destroyed their personal relationship completely. So Bateson and Hugo de Vries actually believed that the statistical theories of heredity were clearly nonsense, because now you have Mendel's laws, and that is how heredity works. And they believed that Mendel's laws meant that you would get these discrete contrasting traits, and selection could at best help you sort of eliminate one contrasting trait and get the other one fixed in the population, and so on. So they actually conceptualized selection as merely having a trimming role to play in a population. It would remove the unfit types, and the fit type would remain, or the fit types would remain. Therefore, what they believed was that selection could not direct the course of evolution. Rather, the course of evolution would be determined by the developmental mechanisms by which these different discrete types emerge in the first place. And this is the basis of what Hugo de Vries called the mutation theory of evolution. So the mutations referred to these discrete types. William Bateson became the greatest champion of this view in the UK, and this was what led to the violent confrontation with the more biometrical statistical approach of his friend Weldon and Pearson. So in this view, what directs the course of evolution is, in today's language, a pattern of developmental constraints that sort of say that, look, not all types are possible. These are the 5 types that are possible in this particular lineage of organisms, and then selection can sort of prune you and keep you within that straight and narrow path. But which path is available to which lineage will be determined by developmental constraints in today's language. This view is recently having quite a resurgence. This is now called the theory of developmental bias in evolution, and is very popular in certain circles as we speak. This often happens in science. You know, the same ideas keep coming back after every 50, 60, 70, 80 years, often under new names and with new, some new information added on. But in many ways, much of what is today called evolutionary developmental biology would sound very familiar to William Bateson, except for the details of developmental genetics, which of course he was not familiar with. These are all questions that were raised in those days by people like Bateson. So this was a very different view, and it sort of led to the so-called Mendelians, Bateson and others, rejecting both the principle of natural selection as a really important evolutionary force and rejecting the statistical analysis of heredity, and focusing on Mendelian principles of genetics and this mutation theory of evolution. And on the other side were the biometricians, who said that, look, Mendel's laws might perhaps work for these discrete pairs of traits, but most evolutionarily or ecologically relevant traits are composite traits, like body size, running speed. These are composite traits and these are continuous traits. So there, Mendel's laws are just not going to apply. Mendel's laws apply to a small subset of discrete, dramatically different traits that are of perhaps interest to horticulturists. And when it comes to ecology and evolution, one is interested in these continuously varying traits, which have to be approached statistically, and those are going to be approached statistically through traditional Darwinian natural selection, which is very gradualist. The Mendelians rejected natural selection partly because of Darwin's emphasis on gradualism, and they said, well, like if traits are discrete, there is no scope for gradualism, so let's throw out natural selection. And there was a fairly bitter fight between these two groups that went on for almost 15 years. So this is again one of the interesting historical ironies. Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection all along had been missing a discrete theory of inheritance that would permit the maintenance of variation in a population without pulling it back to the mean or blending it into the mean. The missing link was Mendel's laws, but people did not immediately see that they came together. Instead, there was this big fight between the biometricians and the Mendelians for almost 15 years. And in between, there were certain voices that are not heard at all, including a long-lost echo of Mendel's own voice. If you go back to Mendel's paper, there are English translations available which one can read. It is quite fascinating that Mendel actually makes the point in his original papers read to the Natural History Society of Brno. And he says that now that we have figured out these laws, Mendel's laws for one locus and two loci and so on, he does make the point that if you imagine a trait that is made up of the effect of many of these genetic loci, it can explain phenotypic distributions of a more continuous nature. This point is actually made in Mendel's paper. Udny Yule made the same point, and in the voice of battle, in the noise of battle, that small voice of Udny Yule and Carl Pearson here and there were lost. The battle became more and more intense, and eventually the issue was resolved in 1918 with the publication of a truly remarkable paper by R.A. Fisher, who was then a very young man, had recently finished his undergraduation, and was interested in genetics, trained as a mathematician. But perhaps the person with the most remarkable evolutionary insight, with the exception of Darwin. So Fisher, in a 32-page paper entitled "On the Correlations Between Relatives on the Supposition of Mendelian Inheritance," actually showed formally that if you start from first principles of Mendelian genetics, assume that these continuous traits are made up of the action of a very large number of genes whose effects are small individually but add up, then you can derive all the statistical results on parent offspring or relative correlations, all the statistical results of the biometricians can be derived from the first principles of Mendelian genetics, with this assumption of traits being controlled by large numbers of Mendelian genes with individually small but accumulating effects. So this one paper is truly fascinating for many reasons. 32 pages, published in a fairly obscure journal, because Pearson by that time was somewhat upset with the young Fisher and was not willing to allow it to be published in any of the mainstream journals like Biometrica, which he had founded and he edited. So finally, this was published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and they had to pay paid charges in those days to get it published there. And the paid charges were actually borne by a nephew of Charles Darwin, who was a close friend of Fisher's. So in this paper, from a statistical point of view, what is interesting is this paper introduces for the first time the concept of a variance, and introduces that term and talks about the advantages of using the square of the standard deviation as a measure of variation as opposed to the standard deviation itself, which was what was commonly used at that time. It also practically de novo creates the entire field of quantitative genetics. And this is something that Fisher created largely on his own, although quite a bit of the foundational work was done by people like Pearson. But Pearson sort of did a few special cases. He did not treat things in the most general case. Fisher really developed the entire field of quantitative genetics. And with that, I think I'll stop here for this talk. Maybe if there are any more questions we can take. And the next talk after coffee, we'll actually talk a little bit about the central issue of what it is that quantitative genetics does from an evolutionary point of view. Thank you. Well, that's not how people saw that, although you are right. The idea is still statistical. In fact, Mendel's laws are statistical statements. And it's not perhaps a coincidence that among the things that Mendel studied as an undergraduate in Vienna was thermodynamics. And incidentally, Mendel, when he was in Vienna, was a laboratory assistant doing demonstrations for Kepler's lectures. So I don't think it's a coincidence that it was Mendel who actually built a probabilistic model of heredity, unlike other people who sort of got up to the ratios and said, oh my God, how do we make sense of it? But somehow, at that point, Darwin and some of his followers had been pushing gradualism. And Darwin was actually wedded to gradualism as a philosophical axiom, influenced by Charles Lyell's gradualism in the context of geology, with the idea being that, you know, the same processes that you say acting on a day-to-day basis, extrapolated over enough time, can create dramatic changes. And Darwin built gradualism into his statements in a big way. Huxley actually suggested to him not to. There's this famous remark in a letter by Huxley to Darwin, in which he says that I very much fear that you have unnecessarily tied this millstone of natura non facit saltum around your neck. Nature does not make big jumps. Actually, gradualism is not essential to Darwinian theory at all, but Darwin somehow made it so. So when people came up with these laws pertaining to discrete traits, they said, well, so you have red versus blue, red will disappear, blue will dominate. This is not going to be a gradual process. This can happen very fast. And therefore, since the essence of Darwinism is gradualism, Darwin must be wrong. That's the view they took. I agree, they are both statistical views, and in some sense, I mean, that's what got pointed out in 1918, that there is no contradiction between Mendel's laws pertaining to discrete allelic variants and the changing distributions of parent-offspring correlations in quantitative traits. So yeah, but I think, you see, one of the reasons why I am actually personally very much interested in the history of disciplines, particularly my own, because I think one learns by examining some of these disputes in some detail you get a better understanding of current disputes and the kinds of things that happen during these disputes. There are unconscious biases, unconscious limitations. Very often we are liberated by a new metaphor from something previous, but that liberation actually takes us into a new prison and we become prisoners of the new metaphor. Information is a classic example. If you read the old debates on development, you say, God, when the epigeneticists and preformationists were debating, if only they had the metaphor of a computer software, it would have been such a clean debate. Because they are struggling and they don't have the right metaphor. But today, actually the computer software metaphor has become a bit of a prison of its own. So I think it is really interesting to actually study in some detail the historical development and how often you realize also that many people had overall a tremendously positive impact on the growth of the field, even though their core idea was basically wrong, which is the case for Galton. Galton's influence on the course of genetics and evolution is huge, but the core idea of the ancestral law of heredity is actually not correct. But it's also, so studying the history is also an interesting introduction to how knowledge grows and how the path to some understanding is often very convoluted and has many dead ends and wrong turnings and so on. So one gets a much better appreciation for what we are doing ourselves by looking at what other people did in the past.